There is a room in Houston, Texas, that operated continuously for 8 years and was never empty. Building 30 of the Manned Spacecraft Center, later renamed Johnson Space Center, held the Mission Operations Control Room on its 3rd floor. The room had 72 consoles arranged in 4 rows, facing a wall of projection screens. Each console had its own set of instruments. The screens at the front showed telemetry, trajectory plots, and the mission clock. The mission clock ran in ground-elapsed time. It did not measure hours since launch in the usual sense. It measured elapsed mission duration down to the 100th of a second, a number that mattered because a spacecraft 200,000 miles from Earth doesn't operate on local time, and everything that happens to it has to be indexed to a universal reference point. Every exchange, every instrument reading, every decision made in that room was time-stamped against ground-elapsed time. Apollo 13 is the most documented space mission in history. There are transcripts of every radio exchange between the spacecraft and the ground. There are logs of every instrument reading, graphs of every system parameter, recordings of every medical transmission. The mission generated more paper than any previous Apollo flight, except for one window, between hour 55 and hour 67 of the mission, 11 hours and approximately 4 minutes, the interior of the command module went silent. Not because nothing was happening, because Houston asked it to stop recording. This is the story of those 11 hours, not what was hidden, what was decided not to keep. Apollo 13 launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970 at 2:13 p.m. Eastern Time. The Saturn V rocket produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust and cleared the launch tower in under 12 seconds. By the time it was visible to observers in northern Florida, it had already crossed the sound barrier. The mission was the 3rd attempt at a lunar landing. Apollo 11 had landed 8 months earlier. Apollo 12, 4 months after that. The press had begun to call the program routine. The CBS News broadcast of the Apollo 13 launch drew lower ratings than the programs it preempted. The crew understood this. In a pre-mission interview, Commander James Lovell said that the goal was to make the mission so ordinary that no one would remember it. Lovell was 32 days from his 53rd birthday. He had flown in space 3 times, Gemini 7 in 1965, Gemini 12 in 1966, Apollo 8 in 1968. Apollo 13 would be his 4th mission. He was the most experienced astronaut in the active program. Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, was 36 years old and on his first spaceflight. He had been in the Apollo program since 1966 and had twice been named as backup crew for previous missions. From Mauro, the lunar highland they were targeting, was his. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, was 38. He had joined the astronaut corps in 1966 and had never flown in space. He was assigned to Apollo 13 as backup for Ken Mattingly. And when Mattingly was exposed to rubella 72 hours before launch, Swigert was moved to primary crew. He had not completed the full integrated training sequence with Lovell and Hayes. He joined the mission with incomplete preparation and with the specific responsibility of managing the most complex vehicle in the human-built world. The first 2 days of Apollo 13 were, by every measure, exceptional. Ground controllers described the trajectory as nearly perfect. The spacecraft performance was above nominal on every system. Lovell later wrote that he had the uncomfortable feeling of having nothing to worry about. The flight directors rotated their teams through 12-hour shifts, and the pace of each shift was calm. On the evening of April 12th, 46 hours into the mission, Gene Kranz, the lead flight director, told his team to go get some sleep. There was nothing to manage. That assessment was correct for another 9 hours. At 55:52 GET, Houston asked the crew to perform a standard procedure: agitate the cryogenic tanks in the service module. The tanks held liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen under high pressure, and stirring them prevented the contents from stratifying into denser and lighter layers, which could affect pressure readings. This procedure had been performed on every Apollo mission. It was routine. It took approximately 90 seconds. Jack Swigert received the request and flipped the switch. At 55:54:53 GET, the pressure differential between oxygen tank 1 and oxygen tank 2 collapsed without warning. Inside tank 2, a wiring harness that had been damaged 2 years earlier during a ground test at Kennedy Space Center, a detail that no pre-flight inspection had caught, short-circuited. The insulation on the wires had been degraded by an earlier overheating event during a detanking procedure in 1969. The insulation had burned. The damage was not visible in any routine inspection. The short circuit ignited the remaining insulation. The combustion in an oxygen-rich environment was immediate and complete. Tank 2 ruptured at 55:54:53. The explosion breached a panel on the side of the service module. Jack Swigert transmitted at 55:55:20. Houston, we've had a problem here. Lovell relayed a moment later, Houston, we've had a problem. In the mission control room, Flight Controller Cy Liebergott saw pressure and temperature readings in the fuel cells spike and then drop simultaneously. His first thought was instrumentation failure, a sensor error. A simultaneous failure of 3 fuel cells was not in any emergency procedure because it was considered statistically impossible. He typed commands to reconfigure the readings. The readings did not change. The fuel cells were genuinely failing. The oxygen was genuinely gone. In the next 45 minutes, Houston worked through a cascade of system failures that followed the initial explosion. 2 of the 3 fuel cells, the primary power source for the command module, were dead. The third was losing pressure. Without the fuel cells, the command module had only its re-entry batteries, which were sealed and rechargeable only by the fuel cells. Once those batteries were depleted, there would be no power for re-entry. No power meant no computer. No computer meant no parachute deployment. No parachutes meant no recovery. The spacecraft was 200,000 miles from Earth. It was traveling at approximately 2,000 miles per hour relative to Earth. The Moon was 55 hours away. Earth was 87 hours away via the free return trajectory. Flight Director Glyn Lunny, who had taken over from Gene Kranz at the start of the shift, made the decision in consultation with Kranz. Use the lunar module Aquarius as a lifeboat. The LM had been designed for a 45-hour landing mission. It carried enough oxygen, water, and battery power for 2 people for 45 hours. It now had to carry 3 people for 87 hours. The margins were calculated in real time, by hand, by teams of engineers in Houston who had never prepared for this scenario and had no procedure to follow. What happened next, the transfer from the Odyssey to the Aquarius, is the part of the story most people know. It took approximately 2 hours to power down the command module in a controlled sequence and bring the Aquarius systems online in the correct order. The sequence was improvised in real time, using procedures that the crew and the ground teams developed together over radio, and which were written by hand in the margins of the standard lunar module activation checklist. At 57:40 GET, the command module Odyssey was in full hibernation. The temperature inside was dropping toward freezing. The lights were off, the instruments were off, the heating system was off, and the voice recording system was off. That is when the 11-hour window begins. The recording system in the command module, the data storage equipment that captured the crew's internal voice communications, was on the list of systems that Houston ordered deactivated. The reasoning was direct. Every watt of power consumed by the command module during the coast phase was a watt not available for the re-entry sequence. The re-entry batteries had a fixed charge. Houston needed every amp hour. The system was deactivated. The crew transferred to the Aquarius. From this point until approximately 6700 GET, when limited systems in the Odyssey began a careful, staged reactivation in preparation for the return, the interior of the command module was silent in every sense. No heat, no light, no recording. The crew lived, worked, and made decisions aboard the Aquarius. The communications between the Aquarius and Houston were recorded from Houston's end. The voice transmissions that exist from this period are the crew speaking to the ground, not to each other. Private conversations inside the spacecraft during these 11 hours exist only in the memories of two surviving men. Fred Hayes developed a urinary tract infection during this period. He did not report it to the ground until later in the mission, and did not describe it in detail until 1999. The cold temperature inside the spacecraft, it reached -7 degrees Celsius in parts of the Aquarius, accelerated the infection. He managed it silently because there was nothing to be done and because the mission required concentration. Jim Lovell navigated using star sightings through the Aquarius window, manually aligning the guidance platform using a method that had been tested on Earth but never performed under these exact conditions in flight. The procedure worked. It worked because Lovell had done similar work on Apollo 8, and because the Aquarius's optics were adequate for the task, and because the crew's positioning of the spacecraft was precise enough to give him a valid sighting window. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot without full mission training, calculated the corrections to the free return trajectory using the Aquarius's systems he had not been scheduled to operate as primary pilot. He performed the calculations correctly. None of this, the infection, the navigation, the calculations, was recorded inside the spacecraft during those 11 hours. The technical explanation for the voice recording gap is complete and internally consistent. The data storage equipment in the command module consumed electrical power. The re-entry batteries had finite capacity. Houston needed to preserve that capacity for the final hours of the mission. The system was turned off, along with dozens of other non-essential systems, as part of a coordinated emergency power conservation plan. This is true. What is less examined is the specificity of the choice. Other Apollo missions experienced system anomalies without disabling internal audio recording. The command module's voice recording was uniquely deactivated because the command module itself was uniquely shut down, not just reduced in power, but placed in a hibernation state that had never been tested before in flight conditions. Houston was, in effect, operating a vehicle in a configuration it had never been designed to operate in, with no existing procedure to follow. The result was not just a power-saving decision, it was a documentation gap created as a side effect of a survival protocol improvised under pressure. The Apollo 13 Review Board's final report, released in June 1970 and running to 914 pages, traces every component failure, every design decision, every maintenance error that contributed to the explosion. It is, in its way, a complete document. The review board had access to all telemetry data, all voice transcripts from ground stations, all crew debriefings, what the crew said to each other inside the spacecraft during the 11 hours between 5555 and 6700 is not in the report, not because anyone concealed it, because no system was running to capture it. James Lovell wrote about this period in Lost Moon, published in 1994. He describes the cold, the condensation on the walls of the Aquarius, the sleeping bags they used from the lunar surface equipment. He describes looking at the Earth through the window and making the sighting calculations. He does not describe conversations. He writes, "We didn't have time to think about what we were saying to each other. We only had time to say the things that needed to be said." The distinction between those two categories is not made explicit. Fred Hayes published his memoir, Never Panic Early, in 2022. He describes the infection. He describes the darkness in the Odyssey, visible through the hatch between the two modules. He writes that the silence of the command module, cold and dark behind them, was a kind of presence. He does not describe what the three men talked about when they were not talking to Houston. Jack Swigert never wrote a memoir. He died of bone cancer in December 1982, 7 months before he was scheduled to be sworn in as a United States Congressman from Colorado. The only first-person accounts of his experience during those 11 hours are in oral interviews recorded between 1970 and 1982, and in the transcripts of his formal mission debriefing, which records his technical assessments but not his personal recollections. The archive of Apollo 13 is extraordinary in its depth and unusual in its distribution, rich in technical data, rich in radio transcripts, rich in post-mission testimony from 2 of the 3 crew members, and silent at the exact point where the mission was most uncertain and the crew was most isolated. This is not unusual for archives. All archives have gaps. Most gaps are created by the same combination of factors: time pressure, resource constraint, and institutional priority. The gap in Apollo 13's record was created by all 3 simultaneously. What makes it notable is only the context in which it occurred. The moment in which the gap was created was the 11 hours when 3 men were alone in a failing spacecraft, 70 hours from Earth, with 1 working vehicle and no guarantee that the re-entry batteries would hold charge long enough to bring them home. Apollo 13 splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean on April 17, 1970, at 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time. The recovery ship was the USS Iwo Jima. The 3 crew members were in good health with the exception of Hayes' infection and the weight each man had lost from dehydration, 6 pounds on average. The re-entry had gone exactly according to plan. The command module Odyssey was recovered with the crew. It was examined, decommissioned, and eventually donated to the Kansas Cosmosphere and Space Center in Hutchinson, Kansas, where it remains today. The Cosmosphere is open to the public. Visitors can see the Odyssey through a glass partition. The hatch where the crew transferred to the Aquarius is visible. The instrument panels are visible. The data storage equipment, the system whose deactivation created the 11-hour gap, is mounted in its original position inside the capsule. The equipment functions, the connections are intact. The system is preserved in working order as part of the Cosmosphere's conservation program. Between hour 55 and hour 67 of Apollo 13, it had nothing to record. That is not a failure. The mission returned. The crew survived. The record that was kept is extensive and specific and has been studied by historians, engineers, and investigators for 56 years. What the record kept is thorough. What the record did not keep is a window of 11 hours at the exact moment when 3 men were most alone, most at risk, and furthest from the certainty of coming home. That window exists in the archive as a gap. The gap is precisely measured. The gap has a timestamp, 55:55 to 67:00, ground elapsed time April 1970. The Odyssey is open to visitors. You can walk past it in the Kansas Cosmosphere on a Tuesday morning in spring with 20 other people in the gallery and stand across the glass from the interior of the module in which 3 men lived through the most dangerous space mission the United States ever flew. The recording equipment is still there. It last operated at 55:55:04 ground elapsed time, April 13, 1970. There is nothing on it from the hours that followed. That is also a record. If you think the gaps in the archive are worth examining, please subscribe.